I just had a great conversation with one of my idols in the green building community that I haven't ever met until today, Bruce King. Bruce has been around the green building industry for a few decades now, I would say probably, and is a huge proponent of carbon, tracking and making sure that we're assessing the carbon weighting of products and materials that we put into the built environment. And he's actually got a new book coming out very shortly called Build Beyond Zero, which I thought was very cool given the name of this podcast, Destination Zero. He's actually taking it beyond. And it's so inspirational to hear Bruce talk about the need to just kind of stop at what we're doing now, but we really got to look ahead and start changing the game now so that rules and laws take effect years from now that'll trigger how things get built in the future. Otherwise, if we just stand by and do nothing, nothing gets done. So great talk, great conversation with Bruce. So enjoy. Thanks. How are things up in your neck of the woods? Are you still in Marin?
I am. Yeah, yeah. You,
I,
you knew John Schertz.
I did. I was inspired to become a green builder because of John Schertz. I was a builder up there and building custom houses for very rich people who spent too much money on terrible things. And John swayed my thinking one day, and I didn't look back.
Yeah, I've had a bit of that experience myself.
Really?
I resolved into a sort of a Robin Hood mentality. I do the work for them, especially as a structural engineer. Nobody wants to listen to you. You should just stay at the back of the bus and keep quiet. But it paid the bills, fed my children,
Mm-hmm.
and enabled me to do other stuff. Um, and now I don't do that. I don't have to do that anymore. Things
Right.
things have shifted a lot. It's great.
Yeah.
Now I can get paid to do the good stuff. It wasn't true up until a few years ago.
Yeah. That's so cool that you're able to do that and do what you do. I'm so inspired by everything you've done and written and the kind of the pathway you've taken. It's really cool.
Well, thank you. Glad
Sure.
glad it was useful.
So yeah, John kind of shifted my thinking. I mean, I'm a third generation Californian, so I remember my grandmother. I grew up in a lumber yard basically. My grandmother started a lumber and hardware business back in 1915,
Where?
back in L.A., south of L.A., a little town called Carson, which was then called Keystone, which was weird. I have old pictures of just big orange groves everywhere and oil derricks. So it was just all polluted orange groves basically.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid driving all the way up to Oregon with my dad in the big rig, picking up, loads of lumber. And we were the only supplier in that, we built a lot of Huntington Beach and Long Beach with our lumber from our
Uh-huh.
yard. And,
Uh-huh.
and just naturally just became a builder, following dad's footsteps and just never looked back. I wanted to be in the film business for a while, but always fell back to being a builder because it's just kind of natural to me. And then one day I just stumbled on John's talk somewhere and just heard his words and go, shit, man, that's it, man. I'm so tired of seeing all this waste and crap and just, remodeling. I had one client, Marin, we remodeled their house 3 times, 3 different kitchens within 6 years. And it was like sickening and just got like sickening, as someone just not a total advocate of green at that time, but just it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. It just got kind of disgusting as a contractor to be asked to waste that stuff on your behalf, just so you can look cool to your neighbor or whatever. It was, and that kind of shifted. And then I just got in a green building and started teaching it to others. And like you, is really very small audience, but luckily in the Bay Area, it was very receptive to more people, not a lot, but more,
Mm-hmm.
especially there in Marin, and very progressive. I love that. It's still my favorite place on the planet, I think, is Marin County.
So
But
what are you
yeah,
doing in
just
Texas?
I'm in Alabama now, which is, I don't know if it's any better or worse than Texas, but I sure do miss California, and I will be back someday. But just a little life shift here and there. But yeah, it's the first time in 60 odd years I've left the state, and I really miss it. And I kind of know why now. It's just that the beauty of it, for one, and the diversity of the people and the cultures and everything, and hopefully a little bit more progressive in their thinking as far as how we build, and that's kind of the purpose of this show. Is I'm just trying to share the message of we don't need to build like we used to, like my dad told me how to build. We don't need to do that anymore. We have science that teaches us how to build a little bit better, and people like you explore those avenues and really share the science behind it all. And that's what I want to share, is like what they don't know. We get a lot of egotistical designers and builders out there, and big builders. I work for big builders now, and just like trying to influence them is really hard to shift that huge ship. In my latter years, I'm working with big production builders, trying to help them build better boxes, doing inspections and stuff and guidance from HVAC and mechanical and stuff like that. But at the same time, we have a little bit of influence on them about, going forward, maybe you should think about this way, or do it this way, or think about this thermal envelope or this window select, whatever those conversations need to be. They're tricky to have because they're all about, the mighty dollar and what the market's demanding. But I don't know how to make, I mean, it's easy, I think, for the one-off custom home or small community projects than it is hundreds of thousands of units, which these guys and gals are building across the country. And I don't know if we can affect that industry, or can we?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And my conclusion is that I've never had a whole lot of success talking to builders, either big production builders or big commercial builders or small. I mean, most homes in America get built by small operations. Somebody told me recently that the big production builders, only a few percent, or less than 10% anyway, of the homes in America get built by the famous name big production guys. It's mostly just small contractors. And one thing I never do anymore is demean their focus on cost. The mighty dollar or the greed or anything like that. They're trying to make a living in a very, very hard profession. It's really hard. I don't have to tell you. And anybody who survived as a general contractor for more than a year or two has my respect, because it's just really hard. And so they're not going to be inclined to try anything new that might slow them down or cost more money or become a hassle. And so I'm afraid that the other two avenues are a little more diffuse, but it's change public perception and public expectations, generate
Right.
demand for green building, and then also work at the policy level, which is where I'm happy to say I'm doing now with California and the United
Right.
States and various at every level that I can think of, um, to try to influence policy. And though we could get into a lot of details about how you do that with concrete or with lumber or
Right. Right.
with energy performance, but it sort of comes down to putting a price on carbon, as many people point out. Not necessarily as overt and unpolitical as a tax on carbon, but you can put a price on emissions in all sorts of different ways, so that it's painful to do the wrong thing and it's rewarding to do the right thing.
Right. How far or along are we on that pathway, and how close are we to? I mean, I know in California, you're probably leading the way as far as those discussions on political forums, et cetera. And some of that's has movement, and a lot of states are looking at California in that regard. How are we doing? How do you think we're faring, and what do we have left to do?
We're just getting started with shifting the policy environment.
So it's in an infancy stage.
There's a lot of work to do and a lot of heavy lifting to be done. But on the other hand, it's kind of exciting to see polities at every level jumping up and saying, "What do we do? What are we supposed to do?"
Right.
Whereas
Right.
just a few years ago, there was almost nobody.
Right.
And I can give a few examples, but the awareness has fast grown. And so, with regards to buildings and climate and the need for new policy, new regulations, new codes and standards that will drive a climate-friendly architecture rather than just the same old stuff, which is trashing the planet in all sorts of ways. So there's lots of people working on doing the right thing.
Yeah, I've been to a few meetings lately, and it seems like the government folks are a little bit younger too. So maybe that, I don't know if it's a generational thing. Maybe the old guard is leaving the room, and the new ones are a little bit more aware and more cognizant. I don't know. It was just an observation.
There's a bit of that throughout our and every other industry, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I'm thinking of an anecdote that I'm not sure I should pass along, but a very bold and cool thing that somebody did in the federal government, and he's not young. He's a gray-haired guy.
Yeah,
Um, but we were on a big Zoom meeting just a few days ago with a bunch of national representatives and this talking, hashing through. We've been for 2 years. We've been hashing out how to change ASHRAE standards to include embodied carbon,
yeah.
and lots that could be said about that. And
Right,
something will come out of that, but
right, right.
and somebody said, "Oh yeah, but by the way, the federal government's just going to do this," and everybody said, "What? You can't just do it. We have to talk about it." And, no, we're the federal government. We can do that. We're just going to do it. Um, so there's just lots of good stories and there's lots of bad stories. It's going way too slow from what we understand of the climate science and how things are changing for the worse much faster than anybody thought, and that gets worse and worse. Um,
Is that true of us as a country? Do you see that globally, or is that just indicative of the United States kind of being a little bit slow out of the
Outwardly, a lot
gate?
of European countries and a lot of the other affluent countries are outwardly much more progressive than the
Mm,
United States, and in some ways they are, but for the most part, the numbers don't lie. And you look at that graph of CO2 as measured at Mauna Kea, which is the baseline everybody uses, and that thing's just going like this. Had a little tiny hiccup with the 2008 recession, another tiny hiccup with the beginning of the pandemic, but
right.
basically nothing's changed.
Still, right. Still rising.
And a lot of that's driven by China and India, in the building industry and every industry.
Right. And I don't know much about that from a global perspective. Are you saying that just because of their sheer numbers of people and how fast they are building stuff, it's just throwing more emissions into the environment?
They've brought up 2 billion people into the middle class in the last 2 decades. I mean, that's extraordinary what's happened in China. And I finally went myself. I had developed this standard for earth and construction with ASTM, and then they wanted to show it off as some badge of sustainability or something when they were going to China to try to sell their services to the Chinese. And so they brought me along, and I got to go to see Beijing and Hangzhou and a few other places. It was jaw dropping. Everything you hear about China is true and more, and it so radically shifts your perspective on what building is and what's happening
Right.
in the world and so on.
Right.
You hear, for example, the oft quoted number that Architecture 2030 and Ed Masria came up with, which is that they did the numbers, and it's what we're doing right now on Earth is building the equivalent of another New York City every month. An entire another New York City every month right now is happening on Earth. And we in North America say, wow, that sounds like a lot. It doesn't seem like it's that busy. Well, it's not in Texas or Alabama or California, not anywhere in North America. It's all in Asia and India, and it will be in Africa soon enough. And having now visited Cairo um, just a couple of years ago and seen a city that was 5 million is now 25 million in just the course of a few decades, splattered across the desert, and it's all concrete and brick. I never saw any evidence of insulation of any sort. Um, a lot of poverty too, of course, but just jaw dropping, and it's an entirely different scene than what we know in North America.
Right. And how would you even talk about building materials under those conditions? I mean, how do you even have that conversation with those
Well, I
governments?
did. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of what I do is has to do with concrete. I mean, that's the number one building material in the world, and it's a great building material. It
Right.
just has this huge footprint. So, I mean, that's why I was invited to Cairo. It's a big international building conference, invitation only, put on. Well, there are just a lot of very interesting people there. And because I had developed this low carbon concrete building code here in Marin County, which was the first, apparently it really was, I wasn't sure at the time, but apparently it was the first time anybody had tried to address climate via building code. And so because we have a cool building official here, and we're having lunch one day. I said, "Oh, why don't we do a low carbon concrete building code?" He says, "Great," and but he said, "I don't know how to make it happen. It's going to take a bit of money, and I don't have any money." And I said, "Yeah, okay, well, too bad." And we just shot the breeze for some more. And then a few months later, I mean, everything just sort of the stars aligned, and I stumbled into the right room at the right time. So often life comes down to that. And the money showed up, and all the parties showed up, all the stakeholders were there. We had a great process: the cement industry, the concrete industry, general contractors, engineers, concrete producers. Everybody was there, and we had really productive conversations, and it was amazingly smooth.
So did you start
And
and one recipe in your mind and end up with another when you all sat around the table and finally created the recipe?
I don't remember how much of a sense of what that code should look like when I started. I was the scribe. I mean, I sort of got the process started, and then my wonderful colleague Kate Simonen, the founder of the Carbon Leadership Forum up in Seattle, which is like the go-to place for carbon in buildings now, Carbon Leadership Forum. Kate ran the meetings, and she's much better at it than I ever would have been, so that was a blessing. And this is a woman who's just wonderful, and she's both a licensed structural engineer and a licensed architect. Now she's the head of the architecture school at University of Washington, but also running the Carbon Leadership Forum. She's got a lot of balls in the air. Anyway, I don't remember exactly what I had in mind to start, but what we ended up with, we were all happy with. And now, as it's moving to a national stature with ASHRAE, the work I've been doing now with New Buildings Institute, it's taking on a much different form and much more appropriate that will be able to accommodate all building materials as we start to address all building materials. Most of the emissions by far are in cement and steel, but we're going to have to cover everything. It has to be equitable and fair and open and all of that. And also there's emissions throughout the construction industry that you don't know they're there until you start looking and doing the math.
Right.
But for the most part, it's in cement and steel.
Yeah, I remember teaching green building up in Marin in the Bay Area, and we used to try to figure out ways or teach them, if you're going to demo the driveway, use those for stepping stones out somewhere, different ways to try to reutilize it. But then when I get deeper into your ideas, it just all makes sense. You just chomp it up, use it as the aggregate. What else in the recipe is unique that people might not have heard of this, or can you share it? I don't know. I don't want to. One, I guess specifically about the low carbon concrete, your kind of idea about what that looks like or should look like.
Well, first I should plug my book.
Please do.
You've
Yeah, yeah.
probably read The New Carbon Architecture, came out 4 years ago, and its successor that I just finished writing with Chris Magwood last year. It will be out in a couple months. Build Beyond Zero,
Cool.
and it has a 40-page chapter that answers that question: how do you
Okay.
make low carbon concrete?
Right. Can you?
There's no real short answer.
Okay.
It isn't even as simple as use less cement, although that's a good start.
Right. Yeah.
Cement's the glue that holds.
Right. We just talked about fly ash and the other additives that they could be utilized,
Oh yeah,
slag, and that's all I'm sure covered. Yeah.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Concrete is by far the most common building material in the world. It's all they use in many parts of the world, like Cairo, as I mentioned. It's
Right.
not an unusual mega city. In India, it's all over concrete. And it's kind of important to step back and recognize that concrete is just artificial rock. You take a bunch of little rocks and bind them together somehow and to make a bigger rock. That's concrete. And you can do it with bags, like tires and bags and gabions and things, but mostly we do it with glue. You glue them together. And the glue that we mostly use is Portland cement, which is limestone baked at very high temperature. And the process produces a ton of emissions for every ton of cement you make. So that's a lot of emissions. Concrete itself, pound for pound, is very low carbon material, but we make 10 billion tons of it a year. That's a cube a mile on a side. It's 5 times the height of the Eiffel Tower. That's a lot of concrete every year. And there's a lot of ways to reduce the carbon. And a lot of people working on it, high-tech solutions, low-tech solutions. It's all the buzz in the industry, the mainstream industry. It's what everybody's talking about getting their emissions down. And so a huge behemoth of an industry that doesn't change overnight is changing about as fast as it can because it knows it has to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like the technology is ever changing. So just the plants trying to keep up with that would be a struggle or a challenge.
Yeah, and again, it's like our conversation about the typical home builder. You don't go up to him and give him shit because he's trying to keep his profit margin.
Right.
Um, that's going to go nowhere real fast.
Sure. No, you got to bring solutions or
And likewise, concrete suppliers in anywhere USA, anywhere in the world, they they're juggling a lot of balls and they're trying to get by.
right.
Um,
This is shining a light on that product or material so that everybody knows it just didn't get dug up on the hill next door. It did this, and put out this. So it's like the ingredients on a cereal box to me anyway. Where did that product come from? What is, because we used to talk about it back in the day about you can check the life cycle. Yeah, bullshit. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, depending upon what study or site you're on. And it just got to be a show game to me anyway. And I'm hoping that that's gotten improved upon. Has it? Have we have a better visibility or traceability of life cycle?
it's perhaps a little bit like AA in that the first thing, the huge thing, and the first thing is to acknowledge that you've got a problem. Until you've done that,
Right. Everything
all
is
you're going to
means,
do
yeah.
is do something to make everybody go away, and that's
Right.
that. And the concrete industry has acknowledged it has a problem.
Mm,
And so now, as an industry, as trade associations, and as as companies, because there's a bit of a vertical industry, the big cement companies own a lot of the concrete suppliers in different cities. And they themselves are doing a lot of research and a lot of work to transform how do we go about making artificial rock. And there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff available now. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to be available in a couple of years, and there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that'll be 10 years or 20 years. I mean, eventually, I'm quite confident we're going to be growing concrete. It'll be biological,
cool.
some sort of microbial thing, and the first signs of that are already with us.
Yeah.
There's
Didn't
some
I
cool
see like a
companies.
mushroom brick or something that they were producing somewhere made out of?
Well, yeah, Ecovative makes mushroom insulation. You feed their magic fungi formula to some cellulose, like some old sawdust or old newspapers, and it grows and fills a cavity, and it's
Ah,
insulation.
huh.
They're not selling into the building industry right now because they encountered so many problems. They pulled back and are working on packaging for now.
Right.
But there is a company in North Carolina, Biomason, been there for founded by Ginger Dozier, a lady architect, a wonderful lady, and she started Biomason. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and now she's doing really well. They've grown a lot. They've gotten a new big round of funding and contracts with the Department of Defense, and they make bricks. They make biological bricks that their magic formula, which is bacteria, they can make a brick, and it looks like a brick. It's orange and
Oh,
everything,
you're
and
kidding. Oh my
it
God.
gets its full strength in just a few days,
Oh,
and then it's ready
wow.
to go.
That's amazing.
And now they're working on a technology to be able to do that on site. Right now, they have to do it in their factory. Um, that's still a huge market for them to sell bricks and pavers, but when we get to the point where we can do it on site with your own local soil, imagine a truck coming up to the job site, and you just you have a backhoe, and you scrape out your foundation floor plate, and then you just pour this benign biological sauce in and backhoe it into the soil. Come back in a couple days later, and it's a concrete foundation.
all
Yeah.
on site.
So that's I'm sure that's the future. Baking rocks at high temperature is not going to be around much longer.
Right.
We just can't do that.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask. I mean, because I was taught by my dad, who was probably taught by his dad down the line, and we're stuck in this kind of brick and mortar, stick and stone. This is how we build things. But I love it when people go off on a tangent and do a HUD out of this or do a this out of that. It's not your typical. And I know that's not ever going to happen, or it's going to be a long road for a production builder to shift to that model or whatever. But what's the coolest thing that you've seen out there that's like, that's so cool that they use that whatever their method of doing their abode, uh, so contrary to normal, but is right on the mark, or have you yet?
Wow. My favorite is when the owner of a building who can buy a bigger, better one or scrape it and build a better one doesn't and fixes up what they've got.
Yeah,
That is the best thing you can do for the climate, whether it's a house or a
I
high-rise
totally agree
building.
with you.
I was dismayed this morning in our local paper that the Transamerica Pyramid, this iconic
Hmm.
building in downtown San Francisco, is getting a big makeover. They hired Norman Foster and Partners, famous British architect, who's got a neat design. He did the Apple building. He's done all sorts of famous buildings, but he doesn't know green from his ass. He can talk the talk, but the designs don't reflect any kind of knowledge of how buildings affect climate or any concern about it. And so they're going to spend $100 million remaking this big high-rise building, and they'll probably do some energy improvement, but not the kind of deep retrofit that we need of pretty much every building in every downtown in the world.
Right, right. Yeah, I totally agree with
Your
you.
typical city has a bunch of tall buildings in its core, and then a bunch of low buildings all around it, and sort of big apron going all around it. And the big buildings are only a fraction of percent of the floor space, that's indoor floor space in that metro area,
Right.
but they represent a disproportionate amount of the energy use. And so we have to get good at fixing up the big buildings and the little buildings. You as a builder know, people are just routinely building really crummy buildings in North America. Wood frame is great for earthquakes and terrible for fires. And it's forgiving and easy you can make lots of mistakes and it still holds together okay. But
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, people used to ask me, what's the greenest remodel I can do? I said, don't do anything. Don't spend a dime. Don't go buy a product. Don't hire anybody. Don't have anybody drive to your
I would
house.
disagree. I would say if you're not getting good energy performance now, then
Well, I was a home performance
what you have to
contractor.
do.
Then we could move into that discussion. But if they were just trying to green their house, buying a new whatever bamboo floor or whatever, it's like, no, let's talk about
Yeah,
other things.
right. Yeah,
Right.
no,
Yeah. Because
yeah,
we would always go
yeah.
in and talk about the envelope and how tight is the shell and how good is your insulation performing and you producing CO
Yeah,
in your
it's not
environment.
so sexy to air seal your building. You'd rather put solar panels on top,
I
but the
know it
air
was,
sealing
yeah,
probably is the
crazy.
bigger payoff.
Right. Which is kind of weird because when I got into green like 15 years ago in the Bay Area, it was, solar was like, oh, there's our magic bullet. And now it's like totally like, oh, wait a second. That's kind of not helping the other, parts of our population so well. So let's take another look at that. I mean, I don't want to press you into a corner, but where does that fit into the puzzle, if it does at all? In a typical homeowner,
With equity, you mean?
yeah, well, just the solar piece of the puzzle, PV.
Boy, a thousand things you could say about that,
I
and
know.
I'm not as
Yeah.
knowledgeable as a lot of my friends are, so I'm embarrassed to say
I'm
anything. But
sorry. I probably
I have solar
right. We
panels.
should probably stay in
I
your
have solar
lane.
panels, and I have an electric vehicle,
Right.
and you get this little charge out of having the car out in the driveway. You're getting recharged by the sun, and so I can drive around town on solar energy. And yeah, but it took a lot of energy and metal and emissions to make those solar panels and to make that car. And that doesn't mean don't do it. It means that we're just learning how to
I
account
know
for
it's just a
everything.
weird balancing act we have to do philosophically and whatever our moral compass is, et cetera. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's a balancing act that some of us have to do, and most of us never will and don't want to, and don't want to be bothered about it. And so you have to. That's where it comes back to policy,
Mm-hmm.
to writing stuff that people can understand. I mean, like writing a building code for concrete.
Right.
We had our building official was part of the process too, which was hugely valuable because he was just telling us things that seem obvious once he says them, but we hadn't been thinking about it. He says, "Nobody wants more rules. Nobody wants any more rules, including us who have to enforce them. We're already trying to enforce a building code that, when you include all the standards and documents that it references externally, it would fill a small house when it was all printed out. I mean, it's far, far beyond anybody's ability to be really on top of." He says, "We don't want any more either." So he was always pressing us, simple, simple, keep it simple, get it simpler, make it really simple. And, those of us who are the geeks and the engineers in the room say, "Well, you don't understand. It's complicated in this dimension."
Columns
No,
in the
no, it's
spreadsheet.
simple.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
simple.
Right.
And so you're always striking that balance in trying to craft a good policy, something that it can't be cheated and gamed, at least any more than the usual amount anyway. And it will be effective, and it'll move the needle
Yeah.
in changing behavior, because that's in the end what you want it to do.
Right. And I totally agree with, and
Um,
that's why I'm so appreciative of the advancements and the progress that at least California is doing and pushing that train ahead a little bit. Because when we were starting, there was no Cal Green, there was no code telling the builder, "Thou shalt do this." And it wasn't until that point that they said, "Oh, I guess we got to put in that faucet or do this or do that." And like, they're not going to do it. I mean, I'm not trying to bash builders. I work for builders, so I got to be nice, but they have to control costs, and like you said, they have a business to run, and then the business is to make a profit. I get it, but it wasn't until, like you just talked about, it wasn't until that rule or that law or that code told them, do it this way now. Or, and I'm glad that we have someone kind of pushing that out, and I hope that more states follow suit. Do you see that kind of nationally? I know it's happening globally, but nationally, do you see kind of the bar getting inched up a little bit?
oh yeah, as I say, I'm working with Ashray, who writes the
Right.
standard 189.1, which most people never heard of, but it is the basis for the Green Construction Code for Cal Green. And then Cal Green makes its own modifications, but that's the base document, and that's what I'm working on now. And because all the big industry heavyweights are there doing the things that they do, some of which have been very positive, I have to give them credit, but some of them are just sleazy. But anyway, eventually something will come out, and it won't even appear to the public until many years down the road, because that's how slowly things move. But and it'll be more watered down than we would have preferred. When we did the code in Marin County, we were acutely aware, it was our intent that it go viral. I call it the guerrilla building
So that it
code.
couldn't be clipped and trimmed, so that everybody would have seen it in its. What do you mean by that?
I mean by that we could write something with a little more bite, a little more impact, a little more actual effect on
Mm-hmm.
emissions than we might have been able to do at a national level with an ANSI standardized process. And there's all these rules for how you write these things at that level. And all the big industry heavyweights are paying a lot of money to keep people in the room who are really good at hindering a process, if that's what they think they need to do to serve their masters, all the while looking like they're helping the process. I mean, it's extraordinary witness. It's like they say about politics. It's like sausage making. You don't want to see it happening. And standards is politics. It's kind of ugly. So we could write something in Marin at a local level that was less watered down and less held up, and we could do it a whole lot faster than we could do it at the national level, and then hope that it would spread. The idea would spread. It would go viral. Throw it out into the system and see if it goes. So I call it a guerrilla
Yeah.
building code with both spellings of the word gorilla. Um,
That's so cool.
and it has worked. I mean, it is replicating in in many places, um, which is which is good generally. But people have to know what they're
Sure.
doing. They couldn't just adopt the Marin County code where they are, because we have numbers and limits that are based on the concrete industry in our
Right.
area. It's different someplace
Right.
else.
But at least that little town, a little California town, just kind of put that thing on the map, and now it's got some national attention. That's really cool, man. That's
I pitched it to our board of supervisors saying we like to claim that we're the birthplace of hot tubs and mountain bikes, and so this is finishing out our
exactly. There you
trifecta. We'll
go.
have the world's first
The
climate-friendly
trilogy.
building
Yeah,
code.
the Marin trilogy.
Yeah.
That is so cool. So you're what are you doing these days that kind of gets you going and gets you passionate about waking up and getting going? Is it the advocacy stuff to kind of push that needle a little bit? Is it sharing your stuff with that? What do you like to do?
Well, I give a lot of talks. Um, in fact, I'm giving a talk in your neighborhood, the Hot and Humid conference in early May in Austin. And I won't be there. I won't be able to be there because I'm getting a new knee in a few weeks and I won't be able to travel there, but I'll be doing it by Zoom. And that sort of thing, a keynote thing where I get to sort of wave my arms and
Ah,
speak in
cool.
the big picture, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and it turns out some people are interested in hearing what I have to say about buildings and our impact on the environment. And because I've been a structural engineer for over 40 years, I have some credibility. I have worked on a lot of buildings in a lot
You
of
have the cred,
situations,
bro.
and I've made a lot of
Right? You
mistakes.
can't
And
hide from the credibility. It's there. You got it tattooed on your forehead, whether you like it or not. But we appreciate everything that you do, and so looking forward to hearing your words in Austin. I might not go, but I'm definitely going to hear the call. I definitely want to hear what you have to say. So
I love every chance I get to spread the word. And working on policy is dreary. It's dreary
that's
stuff,
yeah,
but it's absolutely necessary. It's one of those. I do it because I'm committed in some
right.
fashion
Do you
to.
see people kind of behind you that you can kind of pass the baton to and say, "Okay, here you go, your turn," because that's what I'm always on the lookout for. I love like you. I love sharing it and inspiring and talking to others, but I am also looking at scanning the crowd. Who's kind of standing? Who's that next wave?
Oh yeah, I'm often. I get on calls to people working on carbon in buildings. Uh, used to go to meetings, and I hopefully will be soon again, and been Zoom calls. And I'm often the only man
Ah,
in the room, and I'm often the only guy with any gray hair in the room. It's a lot of young. Not, no, it's far more women than there ever were in the past, and it's predominantly women in their 30s and 40s and 20s that I work with now. So there's no problem with people coming up behind me. I'm trying to keep up with them.
exactly. They kind of push us along. They don't stop. Get up. You got another speech to do.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm always working to make sure I'm earning my keep here, and they don't put me on the ice floe.
Put you out to pasture.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the,
No, it's very exciting. There's a whole bunch of people. My one of my projects at the moment is developing educational literature because there's no textbooks right now
yeah, cool idea. Cool.
in undergraduate schools anywhere for carbon. Not just, I mean, there's places where you can learn about energy in buildings for sure, but architects are being taught. Uh, don't get me started. And engineers are still being taught. Structural engineers are being taught how to design using the materials and the mindset of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a certain dynamic pressure happening now in these schools because the students are there. They know, they see the tsunami that's arriving in front of their faces, and their teachers are going, "Oh, yeah, you do the concrete like this, and you make it a little bigger just to make sure, and you put more rebar in there." And wait a minute, what about the emissions and the
Wow, it's
climate?
like they keep rebuilding Humpty
So,
Dumpty and putting him back on that wall. Just keep rebuilding him, putting him back on the wall.
yeah, so my job and my work is to I'm fascinated by how do you get information to knowledge to wisdom to practice. How do you get it out there? How do you get the right knowledge into people's hands so that they can do the right things? The small practicing engineer in Des Moines, Iowa, or the small concrete supplier.
And so this endeavor will help kind of, yeah,
That's the intent, is that we can produce some, and it's not even really textbooks anymore. Of course, it's like PowerPoint pitch
that's
decks
okay.
and
But, just
URL
to
links
find the
and video.
information, just to have it available is a huge step because we were scrambling trying to find
Yeah.
information. It just wasn't out there. But there's been some years.
Yeah, and everybody's so busy, and we're all drinking out of the fire hose all the time anyway. That I mean, I know that if I could talk to a structural engineer, I could spend half an hour, a lunch hour with them, and they'd get the gist of how to do low carbon
Right.
concrete.
Right.
Done. And then give them lots of references if you want to read more, but they don't want to read a whole book. They want to just know, tell me what I need to do, tell me what I need to
Yep.
not do,
Yep.
etc. And it takes a certain style of writing that's backed up by a deep knowledge, but you give them the
Right.
bullet
It's like the
points.
book gets smaller and smaller. The packaging has to get in this tight little box. And there you go. It's got to be digestible. Otherwise, they just pass them.
Well, they have a great discipline in Silicon Valley. I worked with some startups and with some venture capitalists, and there's great mentality of the elevator pitch. And tell me in 25 words, what is it you're doing, and what do you want from me? And if you can't do it in 25 words, go home and come back when you can. Um, which is a pretty valuable discipline. You really have to boil it down. What am I trying to say to people here? And my message is we can not only reduce the huge emissions of the built environment, but in fact flip that around and turn it into a carbon healing machine, a climate healing machine that absorbs carbon, and that we can build buildings that actually have absorbed more carbon in their lifetime than they ever emitted, and become one of the repositories for the carbon we draw back down from the sky, which is what we need to do.
And with that, I thank you, sir. Those are very profound words, and I hope everybody takes that to heart. Thank you so much, Bruce, for your time, and keep up the great work. I really appreciate it. And you're such an inspiration to us all, and we'll support you in whatever you do. So keep us up to date on everything. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having
All
me.
right. See you later. Take
All right.
care.
Bye
Bye.
now.